My name is Emily Carter, and I never thought I'd be grateful for installing security cameras around my backyard until they became the key witnesses in what would later be known as the Great HOA Cement Scandal. I live in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood known for its pristine lawns, cookie-cutter houses, and an HOA board that some might call overzealous. Last summer, I decided to renovate my aging pool, a project I had been planning for years. After a particularly successful year running my interior design business, I finally had the funds to give my backyard the modern, luxurious makeover it deserved. I followed every HOA rule to the letter, submitted blueprints, material samples, and even a 3D rendering to show how minimal the changes would be. My plan? A simple update to the tiles, energy-efficient features, and modern safety measures. Nothing extravagant. The HOA Review Board approved my renovation with a 4-to-1 vote. The only dissenting voice? Margaret Lancaster, our recently elected HOA president. I should have known that one vote would turn my simple home improvement project into a neighborhood scandal involving the police, an FBI investigation, and a shocking financial conspiracy. At first, I thought Margaret Lancaster's no vote was just her being overly picky. She spent 15 minutes arguing that my blue tile selection was too European and didn't match the traditional American aesthetic of the neighborhood. But since the majority of the board had approved my renovation, I didn't worry too much. That was a huge mistake. A week after approval, I started receiving HOA violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. First, it was a complaint that my lawn was half an inch too tall. Then, I was cited because my mailbox wasn't reflective enough at night. When I installed a security doorbell camera, which was explicitly permitted in the HOA guidelines, I got another warning for having visible surveillance equipment. Each letter bore Margaret's signature, neatly printed with a smiley face at the end, somehow making it feel even more threatening. Then, she started showing up. Every morning, Margaret would park her silver BMW across the street, sitting in her car for hours, photographing the workers and taking notes on her iPad. When I confronted her, she flashed a fake, saccharine smile and said, "Oh, I'm just documenting all the violations for our monthly meeting, sweetie. Someone has to maintain our community standards." I tried to reason with her. I invited her over to inspect the work. I offered to show her the approved plans again. I even suggested we discuss any concerns over coffee. Her response: "I don't fraternize with rule breakers, Emily. It sets a bad precedent." Mind you, this was the same woman who had somehow gotten HOA approval to install a 20-foot fountain in her front yard, shaped like a giant swan. Still, I pushed forward. My pool renovation was almost complete when I received an emergency cease and desist order from the HOA. According to Margaret, an anonymous resident had reported that my depth markers were not in Times New Roman font, as supposedly required by Section 7.3.2 of the HOA guidelines. I was furious. I stormed over to Margaret's house, HOA guidelines in hand, ready to prove that her font requirement was completely made up. When she answered the door, she was dressed in tennis gear, sipping white wine. At 11 a.m. "Oh, Emily," she said, inspecting her perfectly manicured nails. "I was just about to call you. We've had even more complaints about your little project." Then, I saw it. On her entry table, she had a thicker version of the HOA handbook than the one I owned. When I asked about it, she simply smiled and said, "This is the President's copy. It includes all the amendments that haven't been officially distributed yet. We have to maintain some executive privileges, don't we?" I left her house furious but determined to handle this professionally. I emailed the entire HOA board, requesting an emergency meeting to address the new rules Margaret had been citing. 3 board members responded immediately. They had no idea about these so-called amendments. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. Margaret was not happy. What I didn't know was that she had no intention of waiting for that meeting. That very night, she would try to destroy my pool, and in doing so, she would destroy herself. The night before the emergency HOA meeting, I was working late in my home office when I heard the distinct sound of a truck backing up outside. At first, I thought it was just a late-night delivery or maybe a contractor working at another house. But then, I heard voices. I switched to my security camera feed, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. A cement truck was parked in the alley behind my house, and there, standing next to it in designer workout gear, was Margaret Lancaster, barking orders at 2 very confused-looking workers. "Just start pumping it in," she snapped, pointing directly at my unfinished pool. I grabbed my phone, started recording, and ran downstairs. But before I even reached the back door, fate had already decided to intervene. Because Margaret Lancaster had overlooked 3 very important things. 1. An unmarked police car was parked down the street, conducting a routine patrol. 2. My newly installed security floodlights had just been triggered, lighting up the entire backyard. 3. She was standing on the exact spot where my pool contractor had carefully marked an underground power line. Margaret was so focused on her midnight destruction project that she failed to notice Officer Daniel Harris stepping out of his patrol car, watching her with deep suspicion. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see the permits for this work." Margaret spun around so fast, she nearly lost her balance. Under the blinding security lights, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then, just like that, she switched tactics. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she gushed, suddenly adopting her signature sugar-sweet voice. "This pool has been declared a community hazard by the Homeowners Association. I'm simply executing an emergency abatement order." With a flourish, she pulled out what looked like an official document from her Lululemon jacket and handed it to the officer. He studied it for a few seconds before raising an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is an HOA meeting agenda with some handwritten notes. This is not a legal permit." That's when I finally stepped outside, still recording. "Officer, I'm the homeowner, and I definitely didn't authorize this." The cement truck workers, who already looked extremely uncomfortable, quickly started packing up their equipment. Margaret's face went through an impressive range of emotions before settling on pure rage. "I'll sue your company if you leave," she shrieked at the workers. "I had a verbal contract." But just then, there was a loud crackling sound, followed by a pop, and the smell of burning plastic. Remember that underground power line? Margaret, stomping around, had cracked the temporary protective covering. Suddenly, half the block went dark. The security lights flickered, then shut off completely. Officer Harris immediately grabbed his radio, calling for backup and the power company. Margaret, meanwhile, was still furiously texting someone. That's when I noticed the name Frank Urgent flashing on her phone screen. I didn't realize it at the time, but that name would soon expose a scandal much bigger than a single HOA dispute. As we stood in complete darkness, with only the glow of my phone screen recording everything, the reality of the situation started to sink in. Margaret Lancaster, the self-righteous HOA president who had been tormenting me for weeks, was now standing in my backyard, caught red-handed, having just knocked out the power for half the neighborhood. Officer Harris was all business now. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right where you are." Margaret, however, wasn't giving up. "This is a private HOA matter," she insisted, crossing her arms. "You have no jurisdiction here." "Actually," the officer replied, "attempted vandalism and destruction of private property are criminal offenses. I'm going to need to see some identification." Margaret huffed, but before she could say anything else, her phone started buzzing again. The name flashed across the screen. Frank. Urgent. I had no idea who Frank was, but Margaret's reaction said it all. Her eyes widened, her face paled, and for the first time that night, she looked genuinely scared. She declined the call. Officer Harris wasn't stupid. He noticed. "Who's Frank?" he asked casually. "That's none of your concern," Margaret snapped, stuffing her phone back into her jacket. By now, my neighbors had started gathering outside, drawn by the flashing police lights and sudden power outage. Margaret tried to turn the crowd against me, dramatically throwing up her hands. "Emily is destroying our property values," she shouted. "You don't understand what Mediterranean blue tiles will do to this neighborhood's aesthetic integrity." A few people snickered. Even Officer Harris had to turn away for a moment to hide his smirk. Then, Mrs. Turner, my 72-year-old neighbor, shook her head and said, "I remember when the HOA was about community, not control." That was the beginning of the end for Margaret Lancaster. As the police questioned her, the power company arrived, confirming that the damaged power line would take hours to repair. Then, out of nowhere, a second patrol car pulled up. 2 more officers stepped out, one of them holding a file folder. "Ms. Lancaster," one of them said, "we need to ask you a few questions regarding an ongoing investigation." That's when I realized this wasn't just about my pool anymore. Margaret's face froze. She knew. Something much bigger was about to unravel, and whoever Frank was, he had just become the key to taking Margaret Lancaster down for good. Margaret Lancaster's face had gone from arrogant defiance to sheer panic in a matter of seconds. The moment the second officer mentioned an ongoing investigation, she instinctively took a step back, gripping her phone as if it held the key to her escape. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm the HOA president. I was only enforcing community standards." Officer Harris remained calm. "Ma'am, pouring cement into someone else's pool without permission isn't enforcing standards. It's destruction of private property. And we have it all on video." Margaret visibly swallowed, realizing her usual HOA power moves weren't going to work this time. The second officer, Detective Mark Benson, stepped forward and flipped open the folder in his hand. "Ms. Lancaster, we're also looking into some financial irregularities involving the HOA's violation fines. We have reason to believe that funds were being siphoned into a private account." I watched as Margaret's carefully composed mask started to crack. "That's absurd," she sputtered. "Who told you that?" Detective Benson didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a document and handed it to her. "Do you recognize this bank statement?" Margaret snatched the paper and scanned it. Her hands trembled as she saw the account details, the very same ones she had been using to pocket money from bogus HOA fines. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, her phone buzzed again. "Frank, urgent." Margaret hesitated this time. Detective Benson folded his arms. "Franklin Morris has been very cooperative with us," he said, watching her reaction. My stomach dropped. Franklin Morris. I had heard that name before. He was a real estate developer known for buying up struggling HOA communities at ridiculously low prices. it suddenly clicked. Margaret had been artificially lowering our property values, not just with petty fines, but by creating unnecessary violations, delaying renovations, and discouraging neighborhood improvements. And I had been her biggest obstacle. My pool wasn't just a personal renovation, it was a threat to her entire scheme. If my house's value increased, it would raise surrounding property values, making it harder for Frank's company to buy homes cheaply. That's why she had tried so desperately to stop me. I let out a slow breath as the pieces finally fit together. Detective Benson nodded at Officer Harris. "I think we've got enough for an official arrest." Margaret's eyes widened in horror. "Wait, no, this is a misunderstanding," she protested, backing up toward the street. I was just following HOA protocol." "You can explain that downtown," Benson said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. As they led her toward the patrol car, the entire neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, I heard a voice. "Good riddance." The entire street erupted in applause. Margaret Lancaster, the HOA dictator, had finally lost her crown. The morning after Margaret's arrest, I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee and scrolling through the dozens of emails and messages from my neighbors. "Did you see the news? They're calling it Cementgate." I always knew Margaret was shady, but I never imagined this. "Thank you for standing up to her, Emily. You saved our neighborhood." I had gone from being a target of HOA harassment to an unexpected neighborhood hero overnight. But my fight wasn't over yet. That afternoon, I attended the emergency HOA board meeting that had been called in light of Margaret's arrest. She had, of course, texted the board claiming she had a prior commitment and would not be attending. By now, the entire board had seen the security footage of her midnight cement mission and the police report about her financial misconduct. The reaction was unanimous outrage. Janet Wilson, one of the senior board members, stood up first. "I've been reviewing the HOA's financial records," she announced. Margaret was siphoning off thousands in fake violation fines. She even had a separate account set up with Franklin Morris. A murmur of shock went through the room. Another member, Paul Henderson, slammed a binder onto the table. "I say we vote to permanently remove her from the HOA and launch an internal audit immediately." "Seconded," Janet said without hesitation. "All in favor?" Every single hand in the room went up, including mine. Margaret Lancaster was officially stripped of her HOA presidency. But we didn't stop there. For years, Margaret had weaponized the HOA to control and intimidate residents. Now, with her gone, we had an opportunity to fix the system she had abused. We rewrote the HOA bylaws to ensure that all financial records would be made publicly available to residents. Fines and rule changes required a majority vote from the entire board. No more one-person dictatorship. Homeowners had more say in neighborhood decisions, rather than just the board members. And, in a final act of poetic justice, the board voted unanimously to approve my pool renovation. Margaret Lancaster had tried to bury my dream under cement, but instead, her downfall had built something better for the entire community. A few weeks later, as I floated in my brand new pool, the neighborhood gathered for a celebration cookout in my backyard. Mrs. Turner, my elderly neighbor, raised her glass in a toast. "To Emily, for reminding us that sometimes fighting back is the only way to bring a community together." I smiled as the crowd cheered. Margaret had once ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, but in the end, all it took was one woman, a security camera, and a little bit of courage to bring her empire crumbling down. A few months after Margaret Lancaster's downfall, life in Willow Creek Estates felt completely different. The atmosphere was lighter, friendlier, like the whole neighborhood had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. Without Margaret's constant surveillance and petty citations, people felt free to actually enjoy their homes. More than that, we had changed the way the HOA worked. Instead of being a tool for control, it became what it was always meant to be: a way for the community to support each other. And yes, my pool renovation was finally complete. To celebrate, I hosted a neighborhood pool party, something that never would have been possible under Margaret's reign. Families came together, kids splashed in the water, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a real community again. As I sat by the edge of my pool, watching everyone laugh and relax, Mrs. Turner walked up and nudged my arm. "You know," she said, sipping her lemonade, "we should put up a plaque to commemorate all this." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Oh, absolutely. We should call it the Margaret Lancaster Memorial Pool just to rub it in." She smirked. "Actually, I was thinking of something simpler." A week later, I stepped outside to find a small bronze plaque mounted near my pool, courtesy of the new HOA board. It read, "This pool survived cement, corruption, and Karen, and so did we." I burst out laughing. It was perfect. What happened to Margaret? From what I heard, Margaret didn't adjust well to prison life. Apparently, she had tried to start an inmate advisory committee to enforce stricter cell organization rules. It didn't go over well. The guards told me that the other inmates had started calling her the HOA Queen, and, just like in our neighborhood, no one was particularly interested in following her rules. Karma has a funny way of working itself out. Final thoughts. Looking back, I realized this wasn't just about my pool renovation. It was about standing up to corruption and abuse of power. Margaret had used the HOA to intimidate and manipulate people for years. If I hadn't fought back, she would have gotten away with it again. But I did fight back. And because of that, my neighborhood became stronger, fairer, and better for everyone. And me? Well, every morning, I sip my coffee by my beautiful Mediterranean blue pool, knowing that my security cameras are still rolling, just in case any new HOA presidents get any creative ideas about midnight construction projects. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't just winning, it's making sure real change comes from the victory. That, and knowing Margaret Lancaster wakes up every morning in a state-issued orange jumpsuit instead of designer athleisure wear. That's a pretty satisfying bonus. If there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that power should never go unchecked. Margaret Lancaster had ruled our HOA with absolute authority, twisting rules to benefit herself while punishing those who didn't comply. But when someone finally stood up to her, her empire crumbled instantly. Bullies thrive on fear and silence. If I had backed down, if I had let her get away with her ridiculous violations, she would have continued to abuse her position, hurting more people in the process. Instead, I fought back, not with anger, but with evidence, persistence, and a little bit of karma. And in the end, justice was served. So if you ever find yourself dealing with someone abusing their power, remember this: document everything, stand your ground, and never underestimate the power of the truth. HOA horror stories aren't just fiction. They happen all the time. If you live in an HOA community, make sure you know your rights. Read the HOA bylaws carefully so no one can manipulate the rules against you. Document everything: emails, letters, security footage. Evidence is your best defense. Stay involved, attend meetings, vote in elections, and push for transparency. Because at the end of the day, A community should be about helping people, not controlling them.